In part 1 of this video series, we covered the beginning of the Colares UFO flap. In 1977, UFOs began appearing in and around the fishing village of Colares, Brazil. Initially, these UFOs were harmless and inspired awe amongst the inhabitants. Eventually, however, these UFOs began to attack and physically harm the residents, resulting in hundreds of injuries and 2 deaths. These constant attacks soon set the entire region into a panic that became impossible to ignore. The local politicians of the region were soon forced to call on the Brazilian military to come assist with the UFO issue. From this point is where we will continue now. The UFO issue in Colares, Brazil, fell under the jurisdiction of the Brazilian Air Force Base in Belém. The Belém Air Force Base commander was Brigadier General Protásio Lopes de Oliveira. He soon directed the beginning of an operation to get to the bottom of these so-called UFO reports that the countryside was going into a hysteria over. At this time, the military had assumed that the people of Colares and the surrounding area were just uneducated, superstitious farmers. The mission to get to the bottom of this would be called Operac Prato, Portuguese for Operation Saucer, or literally Operation Plate. Operac Prato was handed to the base's intelligence services, which was headed by Colonel Camilo Ferraz de Barros. Colonel Camilo would work on some investigations, but a bulk of the boots-on-the-ground investigations would be taken by a group of 6 to 12 military sergeants within the base intelligence services. Some of the currently known participants in Operac Prato are as follows. The leader of the operation would be Colonel Yoranga Bolivar Soares de Holanda Lima, who at the time had been in the Brazilian Air Force for roughly 20 years, mostly conducting anti-communist guerrilla operations in the state of Pará. Initially, Colonel Holanda thought that Colonel Camilo was playing a joke on him when he was tasked to take on this operation. Second in command would be Sergeant Flavio Costa, also a 20-year Air Force intelligence officer. A meteorologist graduate from the Aeronautics Special School, he had many skills, and most of the drawings, field reports, and photos were taken by Sergeant Flavio Costa. Sergeant Flavio Costa was also a counterintelligence graduate of the infamous School of the Americas, an American military academy famous for employing torture techniques and for the supposed connection to the CIA. Sergeant Alvaro Pinto Santos and Petty Officer Moacir Neves de Almeida were 2 other participants in the operation. Sergeant Carlos Eduardo Gomez de Sá Custer was the team's helicopter pilot, transporting them to various locations around the state of Pará. Commercial pilot Ubiratan Pinon Frias was contracted by the team to fly his private plane for various missions. Other participants in this mission have not come forward at this time. The Air Force intelligence team set out for Colares in late October of 1977. The military's first task would be to assess the situation in order to produce a complete report on what was going on that set the area into a panic. The team arrived in Colares and introduced themselves to the local mayor, Father Alfredo de la O, and to town physician Dr. Vallelde. The team was armed with theodolites, powerful glasses, 8mm and 16mm cameras and camcorders, and other equipment. Some of the townsfolk stated that there were American military personnel embedded amongst the Brazilian team. However, none of the Brazilian intelligence officers have confirmed this at this point. The townsfolk were angry that they did not bring any weapons to help defend them against the UFOs. In fact, one of the first things the military officers did when arriving into town was to talk to Dr. Vallelde. They asked her about what had been going on in the town. She told them her account as well as the accounts of others, but the officers then instructed her to tell the townsfolk that there were no UFOs and to tell them that they were all suffering from mass hysteria. Dr. Vallelde was insulted and refused to lie to the community that trusted her. Not knowing what to find during the investigation, the military set up a base of operations and began interviewing alleged witnesses and getting testimonies of the townsfolk. The first evening they arrived, however, the team would have their own UFO encounter. They split into 2 teams that positioned themselves in the locations with the most recorded cases. On the first night in Colares, one of the teams managed to photograph a luminous object that evolved over the region. They were able to calculate the altitude at around 3,000 meters and the speed at around 30,000 kilometers per hour. The object was very different from satellites and meteorites that were also observed at the same time. When they reconnected with the other team, they learned that they too had spotted the same strange object at the same time. The Air Force intelligence team quickly realized that something strange was happening in Colares. Captain Holanda would say, "Operação Prato was intended to demystify those phenomena in the Amazon. I was skeptical about it myself, but after a few weeks of work in the area, when UFOs began to appear from all sides, huge or small, near or far, I had no further doubts." The team soon began to hold the same sentiment as the townfolk. Anger that the Brazilian military had sent them on their mission with no guns, only cameras. The team would continue to interview the local population. Sergeant Alvaro Pinto Santos would later say about arriving in Colares, "People were really afraid, really scared. They didn't know what to do. They were so terrified they didn't fish. They wanted guns to shoot. We had to explain to them that they couldn't shoot the UFOs or that things could get worse." Sergeant Flavio Costa would say, "The people of Colares in a state of collective hysteria, its inhabitants terrified by the appearance of mysterious lights of unknown origin. They don't sleep nor fish. The population lives in a state of terror. People struck by a beam of light suffer what we can call a nervous breakdown, for lack of a better explanation, whose symptoms are always nearly the same: partial or total paralysis, loss of speech, chills, dizziness, hot flashes, hoarseness, tremors, migraine-type headaches, and progressive numbness of the area hit by the beam of light." A preliminary report was sent by the team to their higher-ups in early November of 1977 that read, "We are sorry that we have not reached a fully satisfactory conclusion. There was doubt and a lack of explanation for some details in the occurrence. In thinking that the current situation will continue or worsen, we foresee problems of various kinds, including the possibility of self-elimination by the weakest in spirit as a result of the dread of the unknown. The presence in the region of unidentified flying objects is patent. We did see luminous bodies moving at different altitudes and directions, carrying out complex maneuvers, indicating that these bodies of light are sentient." In this initial phase of the operation, the cases of sightings by the military were generally involving lights at a distance that cannot be explained by natural phenomena, conventional aircraft, satellites, or celestial bodies. Generally, when these events occurred, the probable origin was mentioned in the report. When the observed phenomena was in fact not identified, it was described in detail in the report, which was accompanied by a sketch made on a map of the region, indicating trajectory and other important details. The team would constantly travel to Belém to give these reports to their superiors in the intelligence services before returning to the field. These reports were not made public and kept under tight scrutiny. At one point, agents from the now extinct National Information Service, the Brazilian intelligence agency during the period of the military dictatorship, were sent out to accompany the team. They would join the team for a few days starting on November 28, 1977. Captain Holanda would say about their arrival, "While we were talking and I was giving them a briefing, one of them pointed up and said, 'Look up there.' I had never seen anything like it. I had been for 2 months every night doing that investigation. We were with staff and equipment, with the responsibility of investigating all the facts. I've never seen anything so scary, so clear, so definitive as I was seeing in that moment. Above us, about 200 meters high, there was an object standing exactly where we were. The object was about 30 meters in diameter, black, dark, and with a weak light in the middle, a yellow to amber light, but it was exactly where we were. The object started to emit a very strong yellow light. You could even pick up a needle on the floor. It became clear as day, and that light increased and decreased 5 times. It was not a quick light, or a violent light, as the light of a camera flash. It was nothing like that. It was progressive, as if you had a dimmer and you were gradually increasing and decreasing the light. The UFO did it 5 times, increased and decreased. We didn't have the will, the notion of taking the equipment out of the car to photograph or film the object. First, I thought there would be no time. I had to assemble the machines that were very professional. We kept our eyes on it. The UFO signaled 5 times, and then the yellow center light turned blue. a very beautiful blue, and it fired in an easterly direction, fired from 0 to infinity very quickly, impossible for a ground aircraft to do this. The team soon realized that the equipment they had was not clear in tracking these UFOs. Colonel Camillo Ferraz de Paros, the head of the intelligence services on the Belém Air Force Base, seems to have been in contact with his American counterparts this entire time, reporting to them the findings of the team. He was able to get the American military to supply the Brazilian investigation team with better equipment to conduct the investigation. The team was equipped with higher quality cameras and even a Super 8 video recorder. At this time, the video recordings have not been released, though some of the reports describing the recordings have been. One Super 8 recording report is as follows. Super 8 started in Ananindeua, Rio Guajará River, at 11:32 p.m. on the 21st of January, 1978. First pass. Estimated altitude 900 feet. Shortest distance for observer 3,000 feet estimated. Apparent size 5 AN light, southeast to north. Second pass 1:08 p.m. on January 28, 1978. Conditions that are identical to those previously reported. The UFO came from the north, making a curve of 175 degrees, and the low height disappeared. Though no Super 8 footage from this mission has been released at this time, multiple photos captured by the team have been released. Here are some of the photos captured by the team. As the mission continued, the quantity and quality of the UFO encounters had by the team in townsfolk continued. In early November and December, the team had very close encounters with these UFOs, directly near their camp. During one reconnaissance mission at night, the team observed a large object, shaped like a football, which danced in front of the group for some time. Petty Officer Moacir Neves de Almeida would describe one encounter. He would say, "Several lights, although they were all similar or maybe even identical. It was a light, which when it was closer it was perfectly possible to notice that it had the shape of a plate. Some of them, some smaller lights, and in relation to the others, they presented themselves, and soon after disappeared, with a speed that cannot be explained or calculated." On rare occasions, witnesses would actually report seeing beings. Many reported seeing typical gray-looking beings inside of the cylindrical craft that would appear. Some would report the beings outside of the craft and in their homes. Benedito Campos and his wife Silvia Mara were at home when they spotted an oval, silvery object emitting a greenish beam like a searchlight towards the room where they were lying. Filled with curiosity, they approached a small window, and as they did so, the beam shot in through and made straight for Silvia, throwing her into a sort of benumbed trance-like state. Silvia, who was pregnant at the time, then fainted, whereupon two entities apparently entered the house carrying something resembling a golden torch, and the beam struck Silvia, this time hitting her in the left arm and at the level of the wrist. Her veins seemed to rise up out of the body, so swollen were they by the beam striking them. Eventually, Holanda would have his own encounter with an entity as well. He would sketch the being and describe it as follows. "I was lying on my side, and suddenly a very powerful flash lit up the room. I was startled. I heard a strange thing. Then immediately afterward, there was a being behind me, hugging me. It was a rather strange situation." The captain goes on to describe the alien. "It was 1.5 meters tall, more or less, dressed in a suit resembling an astronaut, or a diving suit. It was kind of soft. It wasn't very tight. I didn't see the face. It had a mask that was lead gray, and I couldn't tell the details of the face. I didn't see any eyes. I didn't see any shape. I was very frightened, and the thing behind me, hugging me, squeezing me, and it spoke into my ear in Portuguese. With a sound, seems like a computer. A metallic voice, it spoke into my ear. 'Take it easy, we aren't going to do you any harm.'" Colonel Holanda's encounter happened in early January and was quickly reported to higher-ups. Upon this encounter, Brigadier General Protásio Lopes de Oliveira quickly closed the operation without explanation. The Brazilian officers were under the impression that this order came directly from the United States, which had kept a distant eye on the whole operation. The team sent their final report, the photos and films, to the Air Force Intelligence Headquarters in Brasilia, the nation's capital. Operac Prato generated approximately 1,000 pages of official documentation, more than 500 photographs of UFOs, drawings, maps, and copies of newspaper reports of the time, and several hours of Super 8 film of the UFOs. The report documented roughly 12 different types of crafts, thousands of witness testimonies, and ultimately came to the conclusion that they could not explain what was happening in Colares and the surrounding area. None of these reports were made public at the time. The official statement from the military was that the hysteria and UFO sightings that occurred in Colares and the surrounding area were the result of optical illusions and a lighthouse offshore. This was an insult to everyone who had encountered the objects that dominated their lives for months, especially since many of the community were fishermen well aware of what a lighthouse looked like. The military officials that were tasked with the report were also insulted. They had gone from viewing the events as some mass hysteria to an actual unexplainable occurrence that needed to be researched. However, like the good military officers they were, they did not speak up about this matter once the military closed the investigation. Captain Holanda would say, "Who are they? For example, nobody knows. Perhaps the most advanced are the Americans, the Russians. Where do they come from? There is no answer. What do they want? We don't know that either." These are the three questions asked, and which no one can answer, which demoralizes the Air Force and the Brazilian government. A few months after the team left, the UFO sightings began to drop in frequency, and by mid-1978, life had returned to relatively normal in Colares and the surrounding area. Many people soon forgot about the UFO wave that had occurred in Colares. However, there are a few that were not satisfied with the government explanation of a lighthouse causing the mass hysteria in the region.